The Bush School, how white Australians have used the one-teacher schools to change, then to serve Aboriginal Australians. Top End and Centre, prepared and presented by Hank Nelson.
I was engaged to a lassie and we were keen to get married, and we were looking for a school with a house, which in those days, not so long after the war, were very scarce. And I was over to her place one weekend when we saw an advertisement in the paper indicating that schools were to start for Aboriginal children in the Territory. So I said to June, who's now my wife, we'll put in for this, because it offered a school and a house. I didn't think I'd get the job, but anyway, I got an interview and went down to Melbourne for interview and was selected for the job. A place 150 miles due west of Alice Springs, and that there would be a new school and a new house there. So I thought, well, if there's going to be a new house and a new school there, I'll ring June up and think about getting married before we went. So my fiancée flew to Sydney and we got married on the Saturday, and on the Monday I was in Alice Springs. When I got to Alice Springs, I asked the district welfare officer of the time what materials and things that I should take out to this new house and new school. And he looked at me and he said, there's no new house or there's no new school, it's on the drawing board. So I thought, oh heavens, what are we going to?
When the Commonwealth took control of the Northern Territory in 1911, there were no government schools for Aborigines. In 1938, there were mixed-race children in all of the 8 government schools in the Territory. 2 of them, the Carlin Compound in Darwin and the school at the old telegraph station near Alice Springs, were reserved for part Aborigines. The race of all children in government schools in the Territory was carefully recorded in 1938. There were said to be 10 octoroons, 55 quadroons, and so on, but not one pupil was registered simply as Aboriginal. In 1950, government policy changed. It began a system of special schools for Aborigines.
We got the keys to the school, and my first impression was that I'd arrived at a giant refrigerator, because this huge silver caravan was there, and it looked like cooling fins on the side, but they were the louvers. And the unit was about 40 feet long and 12 foot high and so on. It was like a big railway carriage. Anyway, there we are in the middle of a plain of nothingness with a few buildings of the homestead, and we've got the keys and in we go, and I settled in for my year at Rockhampton Downs.
At that stage there was a nurse and her husband who was like the community advisor, and they meet us, and Phil really enjoyed himself, because I think he looked on us as, you know, here's more people from the education department, these useless academics coming out, or these teachers, they'll see what life's really like. And he took us from Pepe to the school, and I remember hanging onto the back of this tractor, and I was pregnant then too, I didn't know, and I was hanging on, and there's all this mud, there's just mud, and we got to what was the school, and there was this little van sitting outside, and we were told there were about 85 children, and the van would accommodate probably about 35 comfortably, and the place where we were going to live, and Willie, Phil's wife, opened the door, and she said, gee, you're lucky. And I looked at all the cobwebs, and I think the plumbers or people of the community had been working on the school and the van, and they must have been living there too, and there was food all over, and the mud. I thought, gosh, and she said, gosh, you're really well looked after. Around it there was just dirt. Well, at that stage it was a kind of red dirt. In the dry it became a paler colour, and it was a kind of off-white dust that blew into everything. One of the first jobs we did was to start planting grass. And we had the kids, we divided up squares, and we had so many kids onto each square, and we got some of the women came up from the community to help, and we physically planted that grass all around, so that by the time the next wet came there was something there, and some trees.
When I say a caravan, it doesn't really conjure up what it was. It would be these days called a transportable building, although it still had wheels and axles and so on. It stood about 1.5 metres off the ground, so we had big iron steps to get into it. Very nice interior, wood panelling, equipped for electricity but not connected, of course. We had gas light fittings on the roof, no curtaining, fly wire on the windows, which was good on a cattle station, built-in blackboards on the walls, pin boards.
It had a concrete veranda, but no, and cover. Actually, it had the cover, but no concrete yet because that hadn't been done. And inside, we had no chairs or tables. Now, that was deliberate. The community had said that they wanted as little interference as possible in terms of the traditional culture of the people, and I think that had been interpreted as meaning that they didn't need desks and chairs. There were some mats, and there was some paper, pencils, and that was about it.
When Ida Stanley opened the first government school in Alice Springs in 1914, she was 500 kilometres from Oodnadatta, her nearest school to the south, and over 1,000 kilometres from Pine Creek to the north. But even in more recent years, teachers who have gone to cattle stations or followed Aborigines to homelands have been just as isolated.
The Barkly Tablelands, it's like a ship at sea when you're out there. There really are no landmarks. You're followed by windmill, which have numbers on them, or by bores. And finally we came to a grid, and it was slightly higher than the surrounding plain. So I turned the engine off, parked the car on the grid, and listened. I could hear a thumping sound of a generator somewhere not too far away. And we thought we could see lights. I stood up on the roof of the car, and it was the homestead of Rockhampton Downs. And just as we got there, they turned. We would have had to camp out somewhere on the plains.
From sort of Raymond's point of view, the worst aspect of out there is that there's no rubbish tip. I mean, everybody who's sort of poor everywhere else, like if you were poor in Canberra, there's so many wealthy people around you throwing things away that you could live off anything. You know, the rubbish tip or whatever's filled with wood and wire, and there's places that recycle clothing, and you can go over places and get really cheap electrical goods, and, you know, if you're really careful and clever, you can live quite cheaply for very little. Well, out there's nothing, right? There's only what you remember to take. So you've even got to take your own rubbish. So Raymond went into second-hand places and bought, like, you know, a sort of a drum of other people's old rubbishy screws and washers. You know, Bill Smith had died 6 months ago and someone had taken all his rubbish along. Well, he bought up all Bill Smith's rubbish. So we took out what looked like a load of old rubbish, and we've been living off Raymond's loads of old rubbish for 3 years. You know, they're absolutely invaluable.
I'd used the telephone, I think, for the first time in about 3 years, and rung them to say, oh, look, this is Lake Nash School. That's the office station telephone. And they said, Lake Nash. I can remember the bloke putting his hand over the phone and calling, Lake Nash, have we got a school at Lake Nash? That was the sort of sense of isolation you had. Not that it worried me, but because I hadn't ever had a visit from the education officer at Lake Nash. But that was a bit hard. I suppose I lived at Rough for a long while. I got furniture from the government after 2.5 years to live in, but up until then it was a camp stretcher and a suitcase. And because I was so isolated, no one came and said to me, you're doing it the wrong way, you're not following the curriculum. And in fact, I got my first visitor in 4.5 years to assess the school, not long before I was leaving to go to Warrabri.
At that stage, there was a group of Aboriginal folk who traditionally would have lived in that area, and they worked on the station or stayed there if they weren't working in the little houses, were fairly rough. There was also a small white population who ran the cattle station, and they belonged to a big company that was based somewhere down in New South Wales. The interaction with them wasn't very cordial. At that stage, schools were being put onto cattle stations. Managers didn't like it very often. I ended up being the meat in the sandwich between the Northern Territory Administration and the cattle station. The Aboriginal folk appreciated very much having the school. This was only its second year of operation. We could have had school 7 days a week, because for the kids there wasn't much else. I was virtually non-existent as far as the human approach was from the cattle station. I'd come to the door. If the manager's wife was sleeping or resting, I didn't get any service. The kids would look at me and say that Mum was sleeping. So I worked out a little bit of a ploy of arriving when it was wireless time, and they were talking to Alice Springs on the Flying Doctor radio. I'd leave my engine running and park under the aerial, and it caused quite a bit of static, and I'd get quick service. So that solved that problem. Still no human contact virtually. A couple of the stockmen had talked to you, but basically I was dirt.
Broad government policy on Aborigines has changed rapidly within the life of one Aboriginal. Schools were agents of assimilation. By the 1970s, integration was replacing assimilation with talk of encouraging Aborigines to develop their own culture, languages, traditions and arts. Soon integration gave way to government claims that it was committed to Aboriginal self-management at all levels. Within a few years, the teacher's role had changed from trying to fit Aborigines into white Australia to trying to serve government and Aboriginal notions of Aboriginal self-management.
It was the most different culture that I have ever lived in. And I've gotten closer to those people, but I think the longer I lived there, the more I realised what I didn't understand. I think we were very romantic in terms of what we thought we were going to do and in terms of what Aboriginal people are like. We'd had a lot of contact with other cultures, so that was good. We'd been used to being in different unfamiliar situations. But I don't think we were really prepared for the complexities of these people. They were just... it took us a long time to realise some of the strategies they use. For example, Nardwin, my TA, she was my auntie. We were immediately given a place, and that happens all over. And my children were related to her, and she was almost my window, if you like, into the community. Then I realised, of course, that I had obligations not only to her, but to her relatives, and that wasn't such a problem, but to other people who thought that they would edge in on it as well. Because I had to say that Nardwin, and I still see her, she's very rarely, she asks me for things, but they're kind of in some ways justifiable. But there were other people whom she used to get really angry with too, who would presume on their relationship with her to ask me for certain things. And they're perennial. I mean, they're things like, I'm just trying to think of a particular example. There was a particular bloke who was related to Nardwin. He came up and asked if he could borrow our vehicle, and Doug and I were both a bit worried about lending it. But he was just so persistent. He said, "Look, I'll only have it for an hour, and I'm only going fishing." And he was so nice about it. And we thought, oh well, we're being a bit mean, so we said fine. And he went off, and he wasn't back now. A couple of hours later, and various people came round and said, "Where's your car?" And we said, "Oh, so and so's taken it off." And I said, "You didn't lend it to him, did you?" And these are people in the community that told us all the stories about how he'd driven into a tree with somebody else's car 3 weeks previously, and how he was blind in one eye, and they really enjoyed it. And he came back with it, and sure enough, it had a few dents in, and I think he'd taken about 20 people. He'd stuck, they'd all kind of pushed in, and there was dead fish in the back. But we laughed about it. But it was actually us wavering because we had the idea we can't. You make excuses, and we made all these excuses, things like, oh, the engine's not too good, the gearbox isn't working. But all those, he didn't really pick up that at all, or didn't want to. We probably should have left a year before we did. We were finding it harder and harder to relate to people in our own culture. I remember driving from Daly River, getting to Daly, and seeing all those people, all those whites there fishing, and thinking, God, they're loud. I mean, that's what I'm like now. But, gosh, they're loud. Why don't they shut up? They just always seem to talk. And I'd go to the supermarket, and within 10 minutes I'd have a headache with the clutter. And I've talked to teachers from our stated schools, the exact same feeling they have. So you start to lose the ability to relate to your own culture.
In the classroom, the teachers of Aborigines faced particular problems arising from local laws. When the school was first started at Yuendamu, the teacher had to put up canvas barriers so that those Aborigines who were not allowed to look upon each other could avoid eye contact. Other schools, too, had to take Aboriginal avoidance laws into consideration.
In most Aboriginal tribal things, there's an avoidance pattern which says that there's about 10% of the people that you can't talk to, look at, or have any dealings with, but you've got 90% that you can deal with. On Groote Island, it's my opinion that the avoidance and taboo thing applies to about 75% of the people, which makes life very, very difficult. And they are tough and they're surly by our standards, and they're aggressive. What you did get at Groote, and you had to learn that they never look at you, because it wasn't till the missionaries had been on Groote Island, since about 1919, I think. I'm probably a few years out, but it's somewhere around end of World War One, and they didn't see, they saw in the distance, but they didn't have any relationships with a Groote Island woman till about 1940, because they used to carry a bark blanket at all times called an inaquampa. And this was because of the avoidance thing. If someone came within your range of vision that you didn't look at, these women had to get down and hide behind this bark blanket, and they were required to carry it at all times. And I am of the opinion that Groote Island women still carry these things. They haven't left with nothing in their hands, but the minute you put them under pressure, they fold up. And the same applied to the boys, but much less so. And you found very odd that you couldn't ever say Abel, or you couldn't single out you couldn't ever say 6 times 7 and say, Michael, what do you think? Because he would immediately go like that. Don't you single me out? So you didn't ever do it. And if you put a kid under any pressure as an individual, that kid would invariably stand up and stalk out and really bang, bang, bang out of the bloody room. And the other kids would immediately go like this, put their fingers over their ears, because he or she would predictably go outside, grab the greatest handful of bloody rocks and just go whack and let them go straight at the school. Through, with windows we used to change, we had boxes of glass levers, we used to change them every bloody morning, the levers. And then they would go home, and they would get Mum and Dad, and Dad would come in with a handful of spears. And these I saw one bloke hit a banana palm 5 times out of 8 with a bloody spear from 100 yards, and they were just devastated. And of course Dad would just throw a spear. He wouldn't throw it, he would throw a spear symbolically, either over the school roof or through the school wall, and then he and Mum would give everybody, the teacher, every other kid, and give them the greatest pay, and then the kid would be crying, and they would take the kid home and say, never mind, we'll... And this is Groote Island society, so I had to come to terms with this, how do you teach them without, when they won't look at you, and so on. And for the oral English thing, with these kids, I hit on, and it was a bit of a fluke again, hit on the device. We made these papier-mâché masks, a crocodile's head, or it might be a pig or a bloody frog or something like that. And so they made these quite nice masks. And the kids, with the masks on, they would talk their bloody heads off to you. And so I thought, well, bugger, we'll have the oral English with the mask. And I could say to this Michael, I said, how are you, Mr. Crocodile? Oh, not too bad, Mr. Egan, not too bad, And he'd say, how you enjoy it? Oh, pretty good, Mr. Egan, And what's 6 times 7? Oh, 42, And because he's got he's a pig or a crocodile or a rabbit or a clown or something, and it was great stuff. And again, being into sport and good at it stood me in great stead, because the girls were perfect. The Groote Island girls would just work their guts out for you. And you could give them set work. And they were just geared to hard work. The boys were a pain in the arse. A couple of them were brilliant in intellectual, no risk, top level IQ. But because of all these things that pubescent boys go through, and particularly in a society like this we're going through, and they were pretty hopeless in school. But the Groote Island people refer to themselves as soldiers. They say, we are soldiers. Those mainland bastards, we are island people. And you'd put a kid under pressure and he might stand up and he wouldn't be looking at you, but if he was angry, he would. He'd say, Mr. Egan, this your island? And you say, that's not my bloody island. This my island. I born here, Mr. Egan. And this would sometimes be before he'd talk. He said, okay, it's your island. I'm not here to take your bloody island, mate. And but they then they said, Mr. Egan, your teacher's marching. And so I can play the drums, reasonably well. And so these bloody boys, they would volunteer for being soldiers after school. And so I used to march them down to the bloody river, this marching along through the crowd. Everyone's, hey, the Groote Island soldiers, And we'd march down the river, and they only knew one game, war. They used to play war all the time. And I was the referee. When I called stop, they stopped. Rather a thrill. And so I thought, well, bugger this is crazy. So 2 weeks out of every 4, I decided to take those boys away from the classroom thing. I gave the girls to one of these missionaries who, the girls were easy to handle. And I used to take the boys out bush for a week. We'd leave at 7 o'clock Monday morning, and they'd come back about 6 o'clock Friday night. Take 2 old guys, and we'd just take these boys out about 20 miles out to a waterhole. And each kid had a very strenuous program of school-type work that he had to do. And the minute he'd finished it, he could go and play war. And so they'd be up at 6 o'clock. Come on, I want to get this reading finished, Mr. Egan, I've got to play. And so away, and they did great stuff. And of course, these old guys used to have them do a traditional thing. And at night, we'd sit around and the old fellas would tell them stories and we'd sing songs, and really top drawer.
In 1964, over half of the teachers in the Territory's Aboriginal schools had been only 1 year or less in the Territory. The teachers were constantly relearning how to communicate across cultures. When Aboriginal self-management became policy, they also had to learn the subtle skills of taking the initiative only on those things on which they had particular expertise. And at other times, they had to know how to wait for the Aborigines to make their own decisions, and then they had to accept those decisions.
I had noticed that there hadn't been any kids around all morning, but I was busy doing other things and I didn't know where they were, and they all sort of came round a sort of a little promontory in the lake, from our sand dune. You looked down over the lake and these little black dots on the white salt lake appeared round the corner, and then they danced all the way from the salt lake all the way up this long gradual hill to the sand dune. And they had about 3 older men who were their sort of trainers, and they'd been there since early morning, and my son told me this because he was involved too. They took them all out there in the early morning, they painted them all up, gave them lots of sort of talks about, the stories about how the people got there, and then drilled them, he reckons, like the army on these dances until it was time to start. And these little kids, they had them all sort of lined up in a long thin line, with boys on one side and girls on the other, and they had these branches of a particular acacia that grows around our water holes in their hands, and they all did this high stepping dance, and they all had this special sort of painting like masks and things all over them and all over their bodies, and they came up the hill, and in front there was a leader, this old man, Mudgera, his Ray's brother, and he's a really wonderful old man in the community, an absolute stalwart supporter of the school. He even acts as a teacher sometimes. He's totally illiterate. He just comes in with me and I'll have some Mandurah on the board and I'll read it in my atrocious accent. He just remembers where every word is, and then he can conduct the class. Kids think it's perfectly all right. Anyhow, he was coming first, and as soon as I saw him I knew what the story was. It was the story of how this particular spring was inhabited by the people in the old days, and Mudgera was being the big man. He had a special big circular logo on his front with radiating lines and looked spectacular. And he was out the front, and then all these, they were all spirit figures, the ones that populated the landscape all this long time ago. And they brought them all the way up the hill, and they danced them all the way up the hill, and then they told them that this is where they came from, and this is where we got all our traditional stories, with this other way as well now. And they led them all in the school, and then all the men, all the leaders, all the big people in the community, and all the women too, all clustered round the outside of the school. They won't actually go in with the men because they keep things separate, but the men were in there and the women were sort of keeping an eye on things. And they all clustered round close to the school, and they took them in the school and they organised them into groups according to their size, and they called out the names of the groups and they told them, you're starting here. It was done really seriously with all these bosses involved. There wasn't a white fella near them. It was there telling their children about their education. It was just so well done. And then 2 of the community leaders gave these really fluent speeches in Mandurah about education and the purpose of education in the community. And then they put their Punmu school t-shirts on over all their painted chests, turned into school children, and then they listened to their speeches, and then they all tumbled out, initiated school children. It was wonderful. And then we had outside in the sort of shaded building, we then had a sort of a more like a white fella ceremony with the visiting people from Perth talking about, their role in getting the money and doing this, that and the other, and how everyone was sort of excited about what was going on. And after that we had our party.
In this program, Top End and Centre, in the Bush School series, You heard the voices of Jim Gallagher, Suzette Thompson, Mick Yubo, Diana Valance, Graham Benjamin and Ted Egan.